Welcome to Marriott Library's Facebook Live event. My name is Allison Maurer, librarian and head of scholarly communication and copyright at Marriott Library. I am very excited for today's event, Reading Between the Headlines. It was originated by Marriott Library's Diversity and Inclusion Committee, which has gathered questions from U of U students for today's panelists, who I will introduce here shortly. Marriott Library does these events as part of its mission to inspire the creation, discovery, and use of knowledge for Utah and the world. And what better way to discover knowledge than with journalists, news editors, and news sites. Resources discussed during today's event are available on a guide for media literacy, which Jordan will post. It's also where the video archive of today's event will go. Now, let me introduce today's panel, going in alphabetical order. Caroline Ballard, host of All Things Considered at KUER News. Marcie Young Cancio, assistant professor of journalism and digital media at Salt Lake Community College and founder, Amplify Utah Media Literacy and Engagement Project. Sheen McFarland, Director of Marketing and Communications at U of U David Eccles School of Business. Eric Peterson, Executive Director of Utah Investigative Journalism Project and Chair of Utah Headliners Chapter. Luiza Ramos, Editor-in-Chief of the Daily Utah Chronicle and Wasatch Magazine. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. I had this question at the end originally, but I decided at the last minute to move it to the top so that we could hear from all of you first before delving into the nitty-gritty. So I thought we could start with Caroline and just go in alphabetical order and tell us what news sites you read and which ones would you recommend to others?
Oh my. All right. So I have a lot. And I think the thing that I always try to start with is start with local first. So sort of my daily roundup definitely starts with Salt Lake Tribune and Deseret News. And then, of course, all of our local TV and radio. So we've got KSL, Fox 13, all of the local affiliates. So that's usually where I start, especially start my day as a local journalist, sort of see where everybody else is in the day, sort of what other people are looking at. As a public radio host, I always have to plug public radio. That's definitely my number one kind of national source. Those are some of the big ones for me. I try to keep a varied diet of news, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about in the next hour. So those are kind of my top hits if I have 15 minutes in the morning, just a quick scan of all of those.
Wonderful. And Marcie, what about you?
I agree. I mean, I start local, like Caroline. I subscribe to the Tribune Online, so I get their daily email that kind of gives me the roundup of the things I should be watching for. So I make sure to read at least half of those stories so I can get the full fill, or get a fill for what's going on beyond just the headline of it. I turn to KUER, local radio, and then I usually listen to Up First from NPR, the podcast in the morning on my way in. It's a nice, like, digestible 5 to 8 minutes usually, and it gives you the top 3 or 4 stories happening in the nation and across the country or across the world. So it's a really nice little nibble before getting into work. And then I also usually end my day listening to the Daily on my drive home while I'm making dinner, because it takes a deeper dive into an issue of the day that I find really informative and interesting. So, and they've done some really great stuff on disinformation, misinformation, and fake news over the last month or so. So I would recommend going and looking at our archives and checking into that. And then beyond that, I go to a wide variety of national sources that I'm checking in with all the time. Washington Post, New York Times, The Atlantic, some other magazines, and kind of broad content across all platforms.
Wonderful. Sheena, how about you?
I will echo that local first, of course. I'm a former Tribune reporter and editor, so the Salt Lake Tribune near and dear to my heart. I am a subscriber online, so I do get their email like Marcie does and go through all of that. And it doesn't feel like a week without a couple of Robert Gerke columns in my life, so that's always great. And I do check out KUER for news coverage. I know that during the legislature, which I used to cover, they were always so on top of everything going on. So it's a really great way to get into local issues that way. And then I have subscriptions to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and then the Seattle paper, whose name I've completely just lost because that's where I'm at this morning. My sister lives up in that area, and so I've been keeping tabs on what's going on in the world up there, and that's been great. And then I do have like CNN alerts on my phone just because I like to kind of see what's going on there, and there are a few opinion columnists on there that I enjoy hearing from.
Great, and I'm jotting all of these down as you guys are mentioning them, and they're going to go on the guide, so this is really great. All right, Ana Luisa, what about you? Oh, I'm sorry, alphabetical order. Eric, I'm sorry, Eric, what about you?
The same as a lot of everybody else on the panel. I like the local stuff. I like to read. I have a digital subscription for the Trib. We also get the weekend print edition. It's nice to have some print products to go through on a Sunday morning. It really is a unique experience to turn and then see something you didn't know you wanted to read and then read it. That's still really valuable, I think. I have a Washington Post digital subscription. I used to have a job where I was in my car all the time and I would listen for hours to the NPR One app because I liked the variety, and I'd get a lot of good local KUER programming too. Radio West, I'm a big fan of. I think I've gotten like 4 or 5 in the last year dynamite book reads from people Doug interviewed on Radio West. Big fan of that. And then I like to just check out the other ones like online, like I read the Deseret News. And I come from a long form background, so I get a couple magazine subscriptions. I like to read The Atlantic and Esquire. Really good profiles. I like the deeper dive kind of stuff like those. And I don't consider myself a fashionable person, but the Esquire magazine is nice. It smells good. They've got all the little cologne in the pages. It's a fun reading experience. Makes me feel fancy.
Yeah, newspapers don't come smelling that great. All right, Ana Luisa.
So I actually, I read the Salt Lake Tribune a lot as well, but I like to go through, on my phone, I just have a lot of different news sources that I go through, whenever I have the time. I like to read a lot of international news, especially news related to Brazil, because that's where my family lives. So I kind of, I go through my international first, because by the time that I wake up, it's already middle of the day over there. So I go through those. And then afterwards, I actually read local news, usually in the evening. I like to read the Daily Utah Chronicle as well. Of course, I have to say that, right? But I usually don't read as much local news just because I try to dedicate my time mostly to international stuff. But I have been reading more and more of, like Eric said, The Atlantic as well, just because I really like those kind of pieces. But at the end of the day, I just don't have the time to read as much as I wish I could, especially with classes that have me read, 40 pages of work a day and all of that stuff. But the good thing is my professors, especially my political science professors, are really good at assigning in-depth pieces of Latin America. And so I'm always up to date because I have those really long articles that I get to read for class as well. So it's really interesting too.
Wonderful. Those are all great suggestions. One of my favorite print resources is called The Week. Does anybody read that? Sheena's nodding her head. It's really great because it like kind of combines all that international and national news. It's not so great with the local So I'll definitely spend time with local papers, but then I like getting the little international heads up all condensed in one print item.
I'm a big fan of the Week too. I've been subscribing to it for about 15 years now, not long after it launched. And the great thing about the Week is it's super digestible nuggets from around the world. And it was an early print version that took news commentary from the right, the left, and the center and kind of presented it all in one magazine. So in terms of this conversation, it's a really useful roundup of news that does, it does everything. It does national news, international news. It has columns from the US, columns and editorials from across the world. It has like real estate news and the best roundup of recipes. It's really like a kind of good all-encompassing source. But the one thing that I think it does really well is it doesn't have any sort of partisan leanings at all. It really does make an intentional effort to showcase editorials and content from left-leaning, right-leaning columnists and to present that as well, which I think is great. But yeah, it's a great magazine.
Great. Okay, so now heading into our questions from other U of U students. The first one, maybe Eric, you could take this one as the president of the Utah Headliners chapter. So who writes headlines and what's the process like?
Happy to take that on first, though. I think I'm actually probably maybe the least informed about this process myself. Just because I kind of have a more non-traditional journalism background. I worked for the Salt Lake City for a long time, and then started this nonprofit I have. So, in the alt weekly world, we the writers would of course just suggest headlines, but we're very directed towards really sarcastic, punny headlines, which a lot of print publications do, but it was really emphasized in the kind of the alt weekly tradition. But that of course kind of changes a lot when these outlets like the Weekly and everyone else were putting more stuff online. You have to really simplify the headlines so they're easily searchable, and the punny headlines just don't get picked up by the SEO as much, unfortunately. And with the work I do now, like I collaborate with outlets, so I suggest headlines, but what they go with, I go with as well. So actually might not be the best person to take that question on,
Okay,
but
yep.
That's how I approach it. So
Fair enough. So Marcie, what about you, or Anna, Luiza, do you want to take a stab? Who writes headlines and what's the process like?
I mean, my answer might not be the most interesting one. So in the Chronicle, especially since I took over, I like to give the writers a lot of autonomy. So basically they have the first crack at writing those headlines. When they're writing their story, they kind of write whatever headline they think of, and then it goes to their desk editors. Usually the desk editors won't mess with it. They will leave it as is. And then we leave it up to our copy editors to kind of see if they like the way that it sounds, if it is AP style, of course. So they kind of are the ones that end up choosing. Back in the day, a couple of years ago, apparently it was up to the copy editors to come up with those headlines. But we just thought that it was better to have the person that's writing the story actually write the headline as well. And then if there is any problem with it, then the copy editors would catch it. I think the main thing to take away from all of that is just we try to give them as much creative choice as possible. Now, like Eric said, I am one of those people that loves puns in my headlines. So when I used to write, I used to do a lot of, little puns or rhymes or anything like that. But I had, when I was assistant editor, my editor, she is a very no nonsense kind of girl. And so she would read through it and she would say, well, we're the news desk. We want this to be a more serious piece. But I think it really speaks volumes when you can have a serious piece, have a little bit of that comic relief. I really do think that that catches people's attention way more. And you can, you know, grab them by having that really catchy headline. So usually when we're working on headlines, especially now, we have a lot of really long headlines. And I'm not really a fan of those because I feel like it needs to grab people's attention, but not show them exactly what's in the article, right? So I think when I'm talking to my copy editors, I'm usually saying, hey, make sure that you don't have that long of a headline. Make sure it's, you know, if you can make it at least, you know, at the very longest, like 5 or 6 words. Don't have it be catchy, but have people also want to read the text to know what it's about. Because that's kind of like, especially now that we're not printing as much, we have a lot of online content that we put on our email blasts. And, you know, the shorter the headline, the better it is, because we can add more stories to those emails as well. So it's a process, but usually I leave it up to the writers so they kind of choose what they want the story to feel like, pretty much.
So in newsrooms, traditionally in newspaper newsrooms, it's the copy editors who write the headlines. Sometimes layout designers would do that as well. And that was because from like just a simple space issue, they knew how much space they were going to have in the actual print edition, how many characters would be allowed for a headline. So having a writer write the headline, not knowing if it was going to be in a column, whether it was going to spread across the top of the front page, dictated the length of that headline. So traditionally, back when we had a physical paper, which, you know, a lot of you, if you're students of the U, might not remember that. Just kidding. But back in the old school days of newspapers, it depended on the copy editors and the layout designers because you were actually working with physical characters and physical space in the newspaper. But online has completely changed the game there. So now it does make, this is why I was curious what Ana Luiza's response was, but now it makes a lot more sense for the writers to be actively involved in writing of those headlines because they know the story better than anybody else. And so those headlines are being posted online, they're being posted in social. And so they need to have that same goal of a headline in print, get your attention, make a reader want to engage with that story. But they're often better versed to do that because of what they know. So in my classes at Salt Lake Community College, I require all of my students hand in headlines with their stories. The writers at the Globe, which is the student newspaper and the student media organization at SLIC, also write their own headlines for that reason. And then editors will work with that and revise it. But that's one of the shifts and changes that has happened as we've moved from kind of a legacy print newsroom into digital newsrooms.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see how that would be a big shift, like now being more about grabbing attention and relaying some information, obviously. But yeah, in the print world, it would be more about maybe just descriptive and getting some attention. But now it's much more about grabbing that online attention.
Well, I mean, it was always about grabbing attention, but now you're competing with so many other voices and so much other noise that grabbing that attention while also not veering into the clickbait world, which I think everyone is now familiar with and uncomfortable with and hates. So it's a delicate balance of writing a headline that is both informative and attention grabbing without being, you won't believe what they did to lose all this weight, right? So, but, you know, love or hate them, the New York Post is famous for its headlines. They have made some of the most, like just come up with some of the most creative and attention grabbing headlines in its long history. You know, some you could argue were problematic and maybe challenged in ways that people don't like, but also really compelling. I mean, I remember living in New York City when Michael Jackson was charged or arrested with some of his assaults. The headline was just, "Who's bad?" with Michael Jackson's mugshot, which is like incredibly catchy because of his multi-platinum record, Bad, you know, so like riffing and playing off of it that way, but it's a balance, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned clickbait because it seems like that's kind of the ethical line. And I'm AP standards really address that. And I'm sure Ana Luiza, as EIC, you have to really work with your writers to make sure they're following those AP standards. I wonder though too, like, because you are really competing with a lot of other social media, like marketing, how you kind of can differentiate that. And I don't know, maybe Sheena, you have something to say, and Caroline, like on how, that line between clickbait and informative headline and grabbing attention.
Right. Well, I think Eric mentioned SEO and how important that is, search engine optimization, and it's really actually dumbed down and made boring a lot of headlines, because you have to have certain keywords that are in your headline so that the search engines pick it up and recognize that that's the topic that you're talking about. And so like at the Tribune, we would always have the web headline, which was this very straightforward, keyword laden headline that had, this is exactly what the topics are going to be in this article. And then you could play a little bit more for the print headline when there was a daily print product that the Tribune made. And so, but you do have to compete against that. And there is always that kind of dark desire to kind of go into the clickbait land, right? To kind of make yourself stand out from other folks. And that's a really dangerous place to go into, because you do start cheapening what you're writing and that kind of thing just to get eyes on your story. And that's not a great place to be. But I think Caroline probably has some great ideas about kind of the headlines that KUER writes.
Yeah, it's a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation in our newsroom. Our process, and it's interesting because with radio was not, up until 20 years ago, there weren't headlines in radio. Like, you weren't really thinking about that. There were sort of top of the hour headlines, but those are different. So once web came into it, and we have websites and we have online versions of our stories, I think it's something that a lot of radio reporters haven't always come to with that's sort of like on the fore of what they're thinking about. So how we deal with headlines is whoever's piece it is usually gets the first crack at writing it. That's part of our web flow. You have the web version of your story, and at the top you come up with it. And we actually have a Slack channel in our Slack workspace for headlines that I think most of the news team is in, where once the reporter has had a headline and it's sort of in shape, it goes in there and people can kind of comment or say, oh, this doesn't make sense, or, what about this? So there's a little bit of a groupthink, which can be fun. And then of course it also always goes back to the reporter for that kind of final sign off that we're not taking it too far in any direction. But that conversation of having something be clickbait versus having it be, serious and reflecting what the story is, it's a balance, I think, that we're trying to strike. And that is always in those conversations of, you want to kind of walk it up to the line where somebody does want, the essence of clickbait is that they click on it, and you do want them to click on it. But no, you don't want listicles like Marcie said of 10 ways to lose weight fat. Like, that's not what we're going for. But I think there does need to be something that like catches somebody's interest and catches their attention. And as you said, everyone's competing for that. I always think of Leslie Knope with her like super long headlines that she's always, if anyone is a fan of Parks and Rec, she's always suggesting to the reporter there. And the reporter's always like, well, it's a little long. So it's a balance, and I don't know that we are always, we try our best, and it's an evolving conversation. And I think taking inspiration from the people who do it really well, as Marcie said, the New York Post, I was just looking it up, the headless body and topless bar is like, that's the example that always gets used from the New York Post, I think, in journalism school, is like, it is so crass, but it tells you exactly what that story is going to be. And so I think taking all of these things and having them in your mind so that you can come in and say, this is what people are interested in, and this is what's going to capture their attention. How do we do that for our publication in a way that reflects our own values and our own, journalistic and ethical principles, while still appealing to them? And it's hard. I mean, props to when everybody gets it right, because I think it's like, it, and it's really exciting.
Right. Great comments. Okay, so we can move to question 2, unless there's other final thoughts on headlines or. Okay, let's jump into the next one. It's kind of a shift from headlines. What is the difference between a news report, a news analysis, and an editorial opinion?
So I can take a first crack at this and let others jump in. I think this kind of bleeds into our next question about why some publications are looked at as more liberal or more conservative. And Marcie was talking about the week having kind of left-leaning and right-leaning editorial pieces. So a news report is just the news story, right? The thing that happens in the day. It's often a breaking news story, or here's what's happening. It can be a longer form piece, but it's facts, and here are different opinions being brought in from experts that you're interviewing, that kind of thing. A news analysis basically is an interpretation of news events, and you're bringing in context and trends and data that you can add to kind of talk about the significance of a news event and kind of give it a broader picture. Some news organizations won't allow news analysis in their news side because I think it's too opinion, and so sometimes they'll put that on the opinion side. So it kind of depends on the publication, and usually they're fairly clear about when those are, where they're put, and they're usually labeled a news analysis. And then an opinion is, an editorial opinion is that, right? It's an opinion from somebody. And this is where you can get folks who are expressing their political ideologies, right? So you have people who are much more conservative leaning, much more liberal leaning, and that should be contained like in a newspaper within the editorial pages. And that is a very separate thing. And I think sometimes folks don't recognize the very strict separation that does exist in a news organization between the editorial and the news side. Like at the Tribune, the editor-in-chief of the news side and the editor of the opinion pages had direct lines to the publisher. There was no communication between them. Occasionally as a reporter, I'd be brought down when someone was coming to meet with the editorial board, and I could use that to hear like an interview and then write a news story from it. But it wouldn't have, that's the only time that crossover really happened. Whatever the editorial side was saying would be very separate from what the news side is saying. Now the Tribune is a nonprofit. They aren't able to do political endorsements anymore, but back, prior to that change, they could say, vote for X, Y, or Z person for president or for governor or whatever seat, and the editorial side would do that. But as a political reporter, I wouldn't be writing about that. I would be writing about the races and saying who was running and kind of what opinions were happening or what controversies might be happening, but it would never be a, you should vote for this person kind of situation there. So hopefully that starts that.
Yeah, and so talking about pages is just different now too. I mean, when you were reading editorials versus news reports in a newspaper, it was very obvious because there was an entire editorial section where all of that, those types of editorials and op-eds, opinion editorials, would be contained. Now it's a lot trickier because on social, the way things are delivered to us digitally, oftentimes through social media, you're getting it as it's shared. It's not presented to you in a box, in a canister that says, here's your op-ed social content for today versus here's your news reports. So it really relies on us as consumers of news content to know the difference. They're still labeled. It will still say analysis at the top. It will still say opinion at the top, but it does require a little more thought from us to be paying attention to that. And then the other thing that complicates it is 24-hour news cycles on cable networks, which in order to exist, they have to fill 24/7 news constantly. So this is why you have a lot of pundits and a lot of talking heads and a lot of people yelling at each other, and just a small portion of the content on the MSNBCs, the CNNs, the Foxes that are news content, because the rest of it is filled with the stuff you have to fill it with in order to fill 24/7 hours of a news cycle. So that complicates it too, when so much of what you associate with a particular cable network is opinion based. So it taints your entire kind of perception of what content that news organization is providing you. So it's really important, I think, when we talk about this type of content, that we're looking at it from a legacy newspaper perspective, from a magazine perspective, from a cable news perspective, from a local television news perspective, from a radio perspective, and then thinking about how, I mean, we're asking you to do a lot as you break down what news media means. It's not a monolithic thing that you can apply to every platform. So that approach is different. And then the digital world has kind of blended the lines on what that looks like. So as consumers, it's on us to recognize and to know the difference between a news report and to acknowledge when someone's opinion is something, and that is not the same thing as news, and that it doesn't degrade the value of the reporting, say from the Salt Lake Tribune or the New York Times, if it feels opinionated, because that's the goal of that piece. But when it's all kind of mixed together in this digital and social pile, sometimes it's harder to separate that out and understand kind of what the perspective or the leanings of that news organization are.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. Like that line has been completely blurred with so many media outlets. It's hard to know as a consumer, if I'm seeing something on TV, is this a report or is it an opinion? Yeah, and Marcie, you're totally right. Like if you read something in print, you get that delineation of like a header, like, oh, here, we're in the opinion section. I know I'm reading an opinion, but yeah, it's different with online and with TV and with radio even too.
And I think, you know, and I'm sure we'll get to this a little bit later, but it's also been hard because the world of the internet has moved so fast and the landscape has changed so quickly that I think we are asking consumers of news to do a lot that they were never taught how to do. Right. And so it's giving people all these things. And I think now we're coming back to talking and thinking about media literacy, and a lot of people just don't have the tools to do that. And I think there's a gap there between, you know, the expectations of what news should be and what the actual landscape is. And there was this place that we haven't necessarily been able to bridge effectively all the time, where some of this confusion creeps in. And I think that's why media literacy is so important. And, you know, I'm sure Marcie can speak to this a little bit more, but about, you know, really educating and figuring out ways to educate people even when they're still young. You know, I don't think that middle or high school is too young to be learning this stuff because they're on their phones. You know, even on TikTok, you need to know what is coming from a credible source, what is a credible source, what you should be looking for. And it's all changed so fast that I think it hammers home why this conversation is so important.
And I did just want to add something, just because when I started at the Chronicle, I was assistant news editor. So one of the big things that we had to do in the news desk was make sure that people weren't accidentally putting their opinion into articles, because honestly, it's one of the hardest things to do is keep your opinion out of an article. And we still have that problem, and we're always going to have that problem because the wording you use really gets your opinion across. And so I think that it's really important to know and to be able to flag down what the opinion of the reporter is, because especially in a publication that's students, right? We're not all journalist majors. Some of us don't have a lot of journalism experience at all, but we're still writing those articles and we still want to be credible sources. So when we were looking through those articles, sometimes we would see an adjective that, you know, some kind of little word in there, and right away we knew our writer was biased towards what they were writing, and that's the only thing we could pinpoint. And sometimes you catch it, but sometimes you don't. So it's really important to know, you know, the difference between a news report and an opinion article, not just because sometimes they're not going to be labeled as an opinion article, right? And that's when it comes to sources that may not be the best, because you are reading something that says news on the headline, right? So you're like, okay, I'm going to get an unbiased opinion, and you read through the article, and sometimes you don't even realize that you're making an opinion based on what the writer is feeding you, and that's really important because sometimes they don't even know they're doing that. So I think that one of the big things that we did, especially when I was in the news desk, was make sure that we had those little words, or the way, maybe talking to the reporter beforehand and saying, how do you feel about this? How can we still give an unbiased report on this? And if you really want to, then maybe you can talk to somebody in the opinion desk to write something about this, but you can't have an opinion about this at all. And it's, and I remember as well, we don't allow our news writers to write for opinion. If they go to opinion, then they can't come back to news. Then that's really important too, because once they have shown their opinion, even if it is in a different article, they can, they're no longer as credible because you already know where they stand. So that's one of the things that we've done in the Chronicle for a long time, and it just keeps us from being an unbiased source. But again, like I said, we are students, right? We're still learning. So sometimes it just comes out that way. And then we have to go through and, redact it or say, oh, maybe this shouldn't be in the website. And it's just a whole process that we try to go through to make sure that we're giving unbiased news reports.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a certain level of professionalism and professionalization that has to go along with being a responsible news organization.
Well, one thing that I would add to that too is, I mean, we're now, again, all living in a very digitally connected world where we're on TikTok and Instagram, and I don't think, Facebook, but maybe not to as much of an extent, particularly with college age students as we were. But we're in a world where we're doing so much on social media, and the very nature of that is presenting ourselves, right? Like, it's about our opinion, it's about us, it's building our personal brands and becoming influencers. So infusing who we are into our social platforms is what we do day in and day out. And so when you're talking now about making that shift to writing news and being aware of those personal biases, because I don't think it's ever possible to take that out of your coverage. Your perspective, your experience will influence the reporting that you do. But to make sure that you don't feel like you have an agenda or that it's one-sided is hard when you are making that shift, and when what you're doing when you're publishing and posting things publicly. And social media is that. It's called social media. You are sharing things constantly, you're sharing perspective. That's a hard shift. And that's not something that I had to shift from, because I did not grow up, I did not cut my teeth in this industry where there was social media. Like, there was this thing called Friendster. I was never on the Napster train, but Friendster was like the thing when I was in my early 20s. I remember signing up for Facebook from the computer lab when I was getting my master's degree. And so, that's a shift. And that's something I think that as student journalists, as educators, as people who are mentoring, as journalists who are mentoring and working, we need to acknowledge that it might not have been as easy as it was maybe for us if we came from the before times of social media, and understanding what that shift is as we're training future journalists. And to Caroline's point as well, media literacy, I think, should start the second you start introducing your kids to media platforms. So as young as 3 or 4, or whenever you start turning on cartoons and talking about what commercials mean, we often don't have conversations about what it means to be media literate until we get to college. And that's if and when you go to college. And it's if and when you take a comm class or a class that addresses these things. It's not any part of a K through 12 curriculum here in Utah. I think that it very much should be. I would love to see that get in front of the legislature and be looped into K through 8 education, K through 12 education. But yes, Caroline, I totally agree with you on that.
So Eric, do you want to chime in at all? I mean, where would you fit investigative journalism in this area of news report versus news analysis versus editorial opinion?
News. It's solidly news, and it should be. Yeah, I would echo a lot of things already said by some of the other panelists. There is a lot of confusion about editorials, and social media has really complicated that. I hate to say it, but because there's a lot of editorial writers that I really like and respect their opinions, but I feel like a lot of media outlets should really be moving away from editorializing as much as possible. And I'd be very careful with news analysis. I like news analysis, but I've also read some where I got halfway through and go, this is an editorial. This definitely feels like an editorial. But it says news analysis right at the top. But then it's got that little, there's some editorializing going on. And that's one of those things that's muddying the waters even further. Yeah, there's a lot said that I think a lot about with some of the stuff, and I think I appreciate the idea of like trying to confront the bias of writers, but it's true, you can't really excise your own personal bias. When we get our first journalism job, or graduate with a journalism degree, we don't evolve into these alien higher beings that are completely objective. We've got our own beliefs and passions, and I think it's fine to use that to inform your journalism, your reporting, but the idea is to adhere to a discipline that is objectivity, not a false belief that objectivity is just this state of being. um, I need to track this study down. It was from a really interesting book I read once, but they talked about a psychological study where they had a mock jury, and it was, they're like, you're a mock jury and you need to make a decision about this, fake like auto accident crash case. And, one group was told, just go for it. And the other group was told, go for it, listen to both sides and be objective. And the group that was told not to be objective, just, they just kind of shot from the hip. They just kind of like made, fast assumptions. They didn't deliberate as long. They were not as thoughtful. But the group that was just told be objective, took it a little bit more seriously, tried to weigh the competing views in this kind of hypothetical scenario, and, actually investigated it further. And that is a thing I think a lot of people don't realize is, the essence of professional journalism is the idea of, we're not pretending that we don't have bias, but we are, practicing a discipline that says that you should really kind of suss this thing out. Don't just follow your belief, test it against the evidence, against, the other side.
This is a conversation that's been, especially in the public media landscape and in journalism sort of as a whole, it's getting a little bit more to that idea of bias maybe than media literacy, but the whole idea also of being sort of an unbiased alien entity, as Eric said, I think it also places certain expectations and certain stereotypes on people. And it has, there's a conversation now of being transparent more so than unbiased, because being unbiased has led a lot of people to say, oh, well, if you come from a certain community, you can't report on that community because you are biased. So it would lead, if you're Black or Latina or whatever it is, that you can't report on those communities because you are biased. And I think that that's led a lot of people down certain rabbit holes of either tokenizing people or, putting these sort of unfair judgments on them. And so it's a conversation. I'm not sure that there are any great answers these days, but I think especially there's a generational shift, I think, happening with younger journalists wanting to embrace more ideas of transparency over unbiased personas. So it's, I can say, I live in this neighborhood, and even though I'm reporting on it, this is sort of where I stand as an individual, maybe not getting into political leanings or anything, but that being transparent, especially about things like identity, can lead to better reporting instead of just saying I can't do that because of who I am or what my experiences have been. That it can, like Eric said, lead you to a better informed place of reporting.
Excellent points. There was a comment from the Facebook page. Somebody is saying where something appears first, last, in the middle, or buried on page one can also be a form of bias or even a form of opinion. Okay. Oh, no, Sheena, go ahead.
I was going to say, there's always that news call, right? When you're in the, as an editor at the Tribune, we would, have Ed board, and we would sit down and talk about what stories were where and what was going to get front page play and that kind of thing. And again, it wasn't us trying to editorialize or trying to be opinionated about it, but you do have to make the call, right, of what gets splashed on the front page, what gets, a few inches buried deep, because that just isn't what we needed to focus on that day for various reasons. So there's always those competing interests that you're always trying to balance, and you're saying, hey, right now this is going to impact the most people or have the biggest need to have the attention on it right now, and maybe later we'll get to something else, but there should be a mention in there at some point. So there's, again, like Caroline's been saying, so much of news is balance, right, and trying to make sure that you're being as fair as you can be, and that can be on a daily basis or looking at it more long term and saying, overall for the last month, how have we been treating this topic, or where has this been played and positioned?
And this is why editors are so important. And shout out to our news director at KUER, who's constantly asking us those questions of, when a reporter is pitching even just something for the daily newscast, I think it comes up probably once a week of, are we covering this because it's important, or are we covering it because we want to cover it, or, because we're expected to cover it, or because our listeners would be interested in, is it actually newsworthy, or is it coming to us because of, the kind of perception of what kind of news organization we are. So double checking those instincts is a really important part of producing news.
Right.
I know, and this, I think we've kind of got things started going into a bunch of the questions we're going to be asking, but this also kind of illustrates why it's so important to have a really broad media diet of sources, because if you just go to one source over and over again, you're at the mercy of the editorial decisions that newsroom makes. And that's fine, but you're only getting one perspective. So diversifying the news sources that you go to is really, really important. Even if you're reading a story about the same event that happened or the same issue, there are going to be different sources in there. There's going to be different information provided. They might present the story differently. They might present something that one news source put at the end of the story up at the top. So part of being, I think, an informed media consumer is taking all of this in, reading it, absorbing it, and then processing what that means for you, your own takeaways, but not just from a singular source. And that will kind of help figure out what to make of these things that you might see as bias from a news organization, and take all that information in and kind of weigh it maybe more realistically in your own mind of what that means.
Good point. So let's move maybe a little bit into misinformation and disinformation. Let's talk a little bit about whether or not fake news is the same as misinformation and disinformation. And I know, Sheena, maybe you could take us off on this one first, and then we can see where it goes.
Sure. So I think it's always important to define these terms, right, so that folks kind of have a working understanding of what those different terms mean, because I think they're used interchangeably in casual conversation, and they aren't, in fact, interchangeable in a lot of ways. So misinformation really is false information that is spread regardless of the intent of that. So this is like when my grandma comes up with something because, Franny down the street said something about it, and that's way incorrect, but it wasn't necessarily because there was an agenda behind it, right? It was just because it was bad information being passed. Like I am an astronomy buff, and I love how occasionally there'll be a story that circulates on social media that says, tonight in the night sky, Mars is going to be as big as the moon, which at that point we're all going to die because Mars is going to come crashing into us. Something is very wrong in the solar system. But people will pass that along and going, oh my gosh, this is so cool. Look in the night sky, you're going to see Mars as big as the moon. No, you're never going to. That's misinformation, right? But there's not an agenda behind it. Disinformation, though, is deliberately misleading or biased information that is often manipulated to serve someone's purpose, right? So during an election, people are going to give disinformation that is going to give false information about an opposing candidate or something like that, because it's serving the agenda of supporting the candidate that you're supporting by spreading fake information or false information about another candidate. Fake news then is really purposefully crafted disinformation that is supposed to look like real news, right? That's supposed to look like it could appear in the pages of the Salt Lake Tribune or on, the broadcast of KUER, when in fact it's completely filled with false or bad information. And I think that's a really dangerous place because you are trying to make it look like something that's real. And I think about back to like my grandparents' generation, and like I think about why they are so quick to consume fake news and pass it along like it's real. And I think it's because they grew up in the time of Walter Cronkite, right? The most trusted man in America, this man who gets out on the news every night and tells you what's real and what's happening. And because he's saying it as if it were real, because it was, that was trusted. And so there's kind of this trust that's built, I think, into that kind of baby boomer and older generation that says, if it's written down, then it's probably real. And if it looks like a news story, it's probably a news story. And so we're talking a lot about media literacy for younger folks, but I think there's a really big need too for media literacy for older generations to say, hey, this looks and feels like a news story, but in fact it's fake news because someone's disinforming you. They're purposely trying to direct you in a way that's incorrect. And that's why you're kind of seeing a lot of the polarization that's happening and people buying into news that is like these conspiracy theories and things that are completely fake because disinformation and fake news are feeding that.
I think we have an ability to share screen, right? I'm going to share something.
Yep.
This is, can you all see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a visual image that was created by Claire Wardle at firstdraftnews.com, kind of breaking down the types of misinformation and disinformation there is. I think this is a really useful tool to think about. Satire and parody, for example, is a type of disinformation. It's not true, it's fake, it's shared with intent and purpose, but for the most part people aren't going to be confused by the fact that that's meant to be humorous. So the content that you get from The Onion or Saturday Night Live when they do news reports, that's meant to be parody, that's meant to be satire. Nobody actually thinks that Matt Damon jumping around at a hearing pretending to be Brett Kavanaugh as he's being nominated for the Supreme Court is actually a Supreme Court justice nominee. So that's one side of it. But then you can get into another side where it's just fabricated content. I call this real fake news because over the last 5 years or so, we've really had a change in how we think about that term fake news. It depends on who's using the word. Real fake news is fake news, things that are proven false, fabricated information. But fake news has also been used a lot by the Trump administration, the previous presidency, and a lot of his followers of content that they don't like, calling it fake news because I don't like it. And that's a very, very dangerous distinction when we're using the same term to apply to two very different things. Mm-hmm. So the conversation around fake news has shifted in and of itself because the definition of it has changed, whether we like it or not, based on how it's used, largely on social media. And then there's a lot of other types of disinformation and misinformation, like misleading content or imposter content, which is where sources might be fabricated to help tell a story. Manipulated content happens all the time, particularly around natural disasters. This image of a shark swimming down a highway first started circulating, a lot of you may have seen this, first started circulating in 2011 during Hurricane Irene. It has appeared in social feeds every single time there's a hurricane or a flood, from Houston to Puerto Rico, everywhere. This is not one, it's not real. You know, it's not real at all, but then it also has appeared several times in several locations connected to different storms. So that's manipulated content. But then there's also misleading content. So a picture of, I can't think of a great example off the top of my head. Oh, I think there's a picture of Obama serving food to some folks during a natural disaster. That photo has then appeared in several other natural disasters to showcase, like, look how good he is. He's down here when the current president isn't down here. So that's misleading too, right? Trying to paint Obama as a more present figure in a natural disaster when that photo was actually from 5 years prior. So information, it's not just conservative or liberal, it can be misleading across the board, and it can be truthful. It can be a true, legit photo associated with a wrong event, which is then misinterpreting what it is. So there's no clean lines on disinformation and misinformation and fake news, which makes, I think, to Sheena's point of mixing up what they mean, very easy to do. And then it's also so shareable. All this is appearing on social media, so it's really easy to see something and to pass it along without giving it really much thought as to the potential damage that it could cause or where it falls in kind of these categories.
And I also just want to add to that, like, I think that there's this idea that, you know, if you fall for fake news, that you're just not as smart or something like that. But I think that I mean, there are things that I read that I have to do, you know, as a trained journalist, have to do a gut check on, because I want it to be true. I read it and I think that sounds right. And then I have to go back and double check and check my sources and say, okay, no, that's not right. And I think, you know, these are very sophisticated, you know, some of them may be unintentional when you get to misinformation, but a lot of these things are really sophisticated. They look so real now. And I think it's only going further in that direction with things like deep fakes, audio fakes. I think one thing that I ended up, as I was researching for this, I ended up on a website that will present you two faces, and one is a real person and one is a computer generated face. And it is hard to distinguish at first. And I think that it shouldn't make people feel like, you know, they have been taken advantage of, but it shouldn't make you feel dumb or lesser than, because these are really sophisticated, and people who are very smart and very trained can also you know, fall into that trap. And that's why it's so important to be doing things like fact checking, diversifying your sources of media content, and you know, just having that second thought to take a minute to say, do I like this because it jives with my perception of the world, or is it not real?
One of my biggest pet peeves, and my family knows this very well, and they still do it, and it still makes me very upset. But my mom lives on Facebook, right? She is always consuming information from Facebook. And the problem is, you know, she is here in the United States and she is reading all of these posts from Brazil. And usually she won't do a lot of extra research, but she likes to share them with her friends and she likes to share them with me. Stuff, usually 90% of what she reads on that, that she thinks is a credible source, she will send it over to me, and it's always not a credible source. And the problem is too, it's not, you know, it's not because she is trying to be informed. She is trying to use Facebook. She has lost her trust on a lot of credible news sites that would give her that information. So she has, you know, used Facebook as kind of the way to keep informed, when really she is being fed a lot of stuff she can't really see if it's credible or not. And just because, you know, she wants to read things in Portuguese, or she wants to know the stuff that her friends know. And then my grandmother, who also uses Facebook as her main source of communication, especially now during COVID, where she can't really talk to anybody else, so she's on Facebook all the time, does the same thing to an even greater extent, because she, like Sheena said, and like Caroline said as well, they're used to reading stuff and thinking it's true every time. And then you put, you know, credible pictures of another news source, or you do something like that, and they will fight you, not because, like Carolyn said, they're I don't want to say stupid, but not because they're not, you know, they are people that usually will consume good news, but they're just so used to seeing these and thinking that they're credible sources, and there's nothing, you know, bad about that. And it's really hard to at least for me, to go up to my grandmother and say, don't take those seriously. You know, I've gotten so many calls from my grandparents because they saw something on Facebook like my city was on fire or something, and then they call me because they are genuinely scared for my safety. They think that what they're seeing is real, and I have to go through, and talk to them, and they won't believe me, but they will believe what they saw on Facebook, which is even more frustrating because you're trying to keep them informed, but you can't really send an article that's in English to them and expect them to understand. They don't speak English, and that information, by the time it gets to them, is so diluted and it's so full of misinformation that they don't, even if they wanted to check their sources, they can't, because it's too fast for a credible source to go and do their homework and reach out to them. So it is really interesting what everyone is saying, because that's a part of social media that is so powerful, because they've gotten to the point that it's faster than credible news can inform them correctly. And it's really frustrating to see that more and more people are just being are gullible enough that they're taking that at face value, and it's making their decisions based on that. Is just really scary.
Right. Well, time flies when we're talking about media and news and fake news, and we are already at the top of the hour. So what about just one last quick plug for media literacy education? Like exactly what Ana Luisa is saying, like what's a good way to deal with our fast moving world?
I'll start with a graphic, as long as I'm sharing graphics.
Yeah.
Allsides.com is a nonprofit that was started to help identify bias in media and kind of where media organizations fall within the spectrum of liberal to conservative. This shifts and changes over time, and they put together this chart. They also go through and track like more than 800 different news organizations. This chart is specifically online content to show where they fall on the spectrum. It doesn't mean if you are liberal leaning in your thought that you don't read conservative, or if you're conservative leaning that you don't read liberal. I like to read from across the spectrum, but that it helps you kind of see where they tend to fall in their coverage. CNN, for example, CNN Online, again, because this is talking just to the online forums, has moved from the leans left to the left side over the last couple of years. This is data from 2021. So over the past few years, it made that move from being leaning liberal to more liberal. So it's good to pay attention to this and see where things are shifting. It's good just to be aware, if you're always going to one source, what kind of content you might be consuming more of, simply because the Huffington Post and Vox are your go-tos. And there's nothing wrong with that, but just being aware of what you're consuming is really, really good. If you know that you want something that is more central, and again, this center does not necessarily mean unbiased. It doesn't mean devoid of opinion. It just means that it tends to approach things a little more from the center view, that it's not leaning left or leaning right. But I love this site. It's great in helping you kind of identify what media bias looks like. And it's tracking things constantly. So my last kind of plea to you all would be informed, educate yourselves, be aware what you're consuming, and actively take steps to know what you're consuming and where that's coming from. That will be one of the biggest things that you can do to be media literate.
Well, that is excellent advice. So thank you, Marcie, and thank you, the rest of the panelists. This has been really, really fun. And I think basically we should just do it again and then get through the rest of the questions that we couldn't even get to. So maybe we could do it again in a couple of months. That would be really great. Thank you so much for your time. And thanks everybody on Facebook for joining us, and watch for all of this content on the Media Literacy Guide. Thank you. Have a good day.